what if, what if the deepest emotional pain you have ever felt, the kind of grief or failure that just leaves you completely hollowed out, what if that wasn't a tragedy at all?
Oh, man. That is a heavy question to start with.
Right. But think about it. What if instead it was actually a highly specific, almost mechanical tool designed by the universe to make you undeniably useful to someone else?
It's a radically counterintuitive premise, for
Yeah.
sure.
Today, we are opening up a notoriously dense 19th century esoteric text that basically demands we look at human suffering not as, a glitch in the software of our lives, but as the raw material for a very specific type of internal alchemy.
Which is fascinating because we spend the vast majority of our lives, and honestly, we dedicate enormous amounts of societal resources just to the avoidance of pain.
Oh, absolutely. We build so much armor. Physical, emotional, psychological armor.
Exactly. And the idea that we should not only accept suffering, but actively utilize it as a mechanism for transformation, I mean, that cuts against our most basic survival instincts.
It really does. But we're diving into a framework today where your wounds are actually the blueprint for your greatest strength. Welcome to another deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a journey.
So to give you all the necessary context before we plunge in, our source material today is a book called Morals and Dogma.
Written by Albert Pike.
Yes, Albert Pike. Published way back in 1871. And if you are not familiar with it, this book is essentially the foundational philosophical textbook for the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry.
Yeah, and we should warn you, it is a massive, incredibly complex volume.
Huge. It explores morality, philosophy, comparative religion, esoteric symbolism, all across 32 distinct degrees or chapters.
But today we are focusing entirely on chapter 25.
Right, which corresponds to the 25th degree, titled The Night of the Brazen Serpent.
And to really understand the weight of this specific chapter, we have to look at the architecture of the text itself, like where it sits in the book.
Okay, set the stage for us. What happened before this?
Well, the preceding chapter, chapter 24, is heavily focused on the external world. It deals with leadership, civic responsibility, and, the ethical execution of duty.
So it's very outward-facing.
Exactly. It places the individual firmly in the public square, managing the affairs of others. But chapter 25 makes this severe, almost jarring pivot inward.
It totally abandons the public square.
It really does. It drops the reader into the darkest, most solitary corners of the human psyche.
And that pivot is so crucial, I think, because it implies a sort of hierarchy of development.
How do you mean?
Well, the text seems to suggest that your external leadership, no matter how skilled you are, is ultimately hollow or fragile if you haven't conquered the internal landscape first.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you can manage a team or a business or an entire community, but if you haven't mastered your own psychological wreckage, your foundation is basically built on sand.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So the core mission of our deep dive today is to explore that internal mastery. We are going to deconstruct the central question of chapter 25, which is how do we transform pain into growth?
And we should state up front that the source material treats this not as some, abstract theoretical exercise. It's a practical necessity.
Right, it's an operating manual.
Oh, exactly. The text views the human experience as inherently fraught with difficulty. Struggle isn't framed as a dead end or some sort of cosmic punishment for poor choices.
Right.
It is positioned as the very catalyst required for renewal.
So as we dissect this process today, it might be highly beneficial for you listening right now to hold a specific personal challenge in your mind.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, think about a current adversity you're facing and measure it against the framework of the night as we go through it.
It'll make the esoteric stuff feel very real.
Exactly. So let's start with the raw material itself. To understand how to transform pain, Pike insists we have to examine the actual nature of suffering.
And his perspective here is entirely uncompromising.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches. The text states that suffering is entirely unavoidable. It is a fundamental, baked-in condition of the human journey.
But there is a crucial distinction made here, right? Suffering is not merely a passive state of misery.
Right, it has a profound function. It can teach, it can transform, and it can strengthen.
And I think the historical context of the author adds such an important layer to this.
Oh, definitely. Tell them about when this was written.
So Pike was writing in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War.
Just a completely brutal time in history.
Unimaginable. He was surrounded by a society grappling with just massive loss, physical mutilation, and psychological trauma on a national scale.
So when he writes about suffering, he isn't writing from some ivory tower about minor inconveniences.
Not at all. He is addressing profound structural devastation. And against that backdrop, the philosophy of the Knight of the Brazen Serpent, it becomes a survival manual.
Which brings us to the specific posture of this knight. Because according to the text, the defining characteristic of the Knight of the Brazen Serpent is that he does not avoid suffering.
Right. And to be clear, this doesn't mean he's a masochist.
No, he isn't seeking out pain just for the thrill of it.
But when the unavoidable suffering arrives, he doesn't try to outrun it.
He doesn't try to numb it, and he doesn't throw up that heavy, rigid armor of denial that we are all so used to wearing. Instead, he leans in to learn from it.
Which requires a total philosophical reconstruction,
Yeah.
You have to transition from viewing pain as a tragedy that is happening to you to viewing it as a harsh, unyielding instructor that is working for you.
Wow.
It is the difference between being a victim of circumstance and being a student of reality.
I think the martial arts analogy is probably the best way to visualize this.
Oh, I like this one. Go ahead.
Well, if you watch a novice fighter, their instinct when a punch is thrown is to put up a rigid block. They tense up, they try to build a wall, and they attempt to stop the kinetic energy head on.
Right, they meet force with force.
Exactly. And usually, the force of the blow just shatters their block and injures them anyway.
Yeah.
But if you watch a master in a discipline like Aikido, their posture is entirely different. They don't build a rigid wall.
They flow with it.
Yes. When the strike comes, they step into it, they absorb the momentum of the attacker, and they redirect that very energy to neutralize the threat.
That's it, exactly.
The Knight of the Brazen Serpent is that master. The knight isn't putting up a shield to bounce the pain away. He is absorbing it to understand how it moves.
That is an incredibly apt visualization, particularly regarding the concept of kinetic energy. Because the suffering possesses energy.
It really does. It hits you like a freight train.
And if you fight it with rigid denial, that energy breaks you. But if you accept its presence, you can harness its momentum.
So the knight's posture is basically one of radical acceptance.
Exactly. The storm is here. Complaining about the rain does not keep you dry.
Okay, but let's pause and introduce some friction here, because I think a lot of people might hear this and feel a justified sense of frustration.
Sure, it sounds a bit lofty.
Yeah, like it is very easy to read a 19th century text and sit in a studio and say, well, just absorb the momentum of your trauma like a martial artist.
Right. Much easier said than done.
But practically speaking, when you are in the acute phase of profound suffering, let's say, the sudden death of a loved one, or a catastrophic medical diagnosis, the brain's physiological response is shock and panic.
Absolutely.
So how does the knight realistically face that level of intense suffering without simply being crushed by the sheer gravity of it?
Well, the text actually anticipates this exact reality, and the answer lies in the distinction between passive endurance and active endurance.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So, but passive endurance is simply white-knuckling your way through a crisis.
Just holding on for dear life.
Right. You hunker down, you dissociate, you shut off your emotional receptors, and you just try to survive until the calendar turns.
And you might survive.
You might, but when the storm finally breaks, you are exactly the same person you were before, just depleted, exhausted, and surrounded by debris.
The event merely happened to you.
Exactly.
You essentially just held your breath for a year.
Precisely. Active endurance, however, is the posture of the knight.
Okay.
Active endurance means you are out in the middle of the storm, but your mind is critically engaged with the environment.
So you aren't hiding.
No. You are feeling how the structural integrity of your psyche is holding up against the wind. You are noticing which of your relationships are providing shelter and which ones are blowing away.
Oh, wow. It's a powerful way to look at it.
You are paying attention to the specific nature of your own despair. You are not crushed by the suffering because your intellect and your spirit are actively engaged in extracting data from the chaos.
The engagement itself provides a scaffolding that keeps you from collapsing.
That's exactly it. The observation is the survival mechanism.
Which flows perfectly into the next major concept of the chapter. Because if you are going to actively endure, if you are going to extract data from the chaos of your own suffering, your brain naturally resists that.
Oh, it fights it tooth and nail.
Right. Our amygdala screams at us to look away from the things that hurt. So what cognitive tool does Pike say the knight uses to override that biological survival instinct?
The tool is awareness.
Awareness.
Yeah. In chapter 25, healing is the central dominating motif. The text inextricably links this healing to comprehensive recovery, spiritual growth, and restoration.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. It establishes an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite: healing requires awareness.
You simply cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge.
Exactly. Without a brutally honest awareness of the wound, growth is not just delayed, it is fundamentally impossible.
This is where I think modern society completely diverges from the wisdom of the text.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because we have constructed an entire ecosystem designed to eliminate awareness. The moment we feel the slightest twinge of psychological discomfort, we have 1,000 readily available anesthetics.
Yep. We can scroll infinitely on our phones.
We can binge watch television, we can turn to substances, we can overwork. We do everything in our power to look away from the brokenness.
But the knight's journey demands that we look directly at the fracture.
And Pike's definition of awareness is entirely active, right?
It is. It is not just a passive realization that, like, oh, I am unhappy. It is a forensic examination of the pain.
A forensic examination. I like that.
Yeah, it involves understanding the precise nature of the suffering, reflecting deeply on the series of choices or circumstances that led to it, and actively learning from the friction.
Furthermore, the text makes it clear that this healing is holistic. It is not just about getting your body to function again. It spans the emotional and spiritual realms.
You must be aware of the damage on all those levels.
It is exactly like treating a severe physical injury. Let's unpack this with an analogy.
Go for it.
Let's say you take a terrible fall and shatter your ankle. The immediate response is agony.
Right.
Now, if your only goal is to eliminate the discomfort, you might take a massive dose of painkillers.
Yeah.
The throbbing stops. You might even be able to numbly walk on it.
But you are not healing.
Exactly. You are masking the damage. In fact, by walking on a shattered bone without feeling it, you are actively destroying the surrounding tissue.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
Awareness, in the context of the Knight of the Brazen Serpent, is the act of taking the X-ray.
The X-ray is the perfect metaphor because it removes the illusion of intactness. It forces you to confront the reality beneath the surface.
And looking at the X-ray is miserable. You sit in the doctor's office, you look at the screen, and you see the jagged, splintered bone.
It forces you to accept a new, unwelcome reality.
Yeah, that you are broken, you're going to be sidelined for months, you cannot do the things you plan to do, and you are going to need help. It is deeply uncomfortable. But looking at that X-ray is the only possible way to understand how to set the bone correctly. If you skip the awareness, if you refuse to look at the X-ray because it makes you sad, the bone will eventually knit itself back together on its own.
But it will heal crooked.
Exactly. It heals crooked.
Healing crooked captures the essence of unresolved trauma perfectly.
Doesn't it?
It really does. There is immense societal pressure to perform resilience, to bounce back immediately after a tragedy and show the world that you are fine.
Hustle culture, toxic positivity, all of that.
Right. But when you rush that process, when you bypass the dark, uncomfortable labor of deep awareness, you stall your true emotional recovery.
You end up carrying an unexamined, improperly set wound.
And a crooked bone changes your entire gait. You will inevitably limp through life, and that unexamined pain will dictate your reactions, your relationships, and your choices.
Often in ways you remain entirely blind to. You see this all the time with people who go through a terrible breakup or a divorce, and they refuse to do the autopsy on what went wrong or their role in it, and they immediately jump into a new relationship.
Oh, yeah. They haven't taken the X-ray.
They are just dragging their crooked, broken emotional framework into a new environment, and they will inevitably recreate the exact same destructive patterns.
Which brings us to the concept of spiritual stability, which is a term the text utilizes to describe the intended result of this process.
Spiritual stability. Okay, what does that look like?
Well, spiritual stability built on denial is incredibly fragile. It requires a massive, constant expenditure of energy to maintain.
Because you're always playing defense.
Right. You are trying to avoid triggers, managing the optics of your life so no one sees the limp. But spiritual stability built on the foundation of brutal self-awareness is rugged.
Rugged. I love that word for this.
You have mapped the darkest corners of your own inadequacy, you have stared at the jagged edges of your own suffering, and you have survived the view.
That kind of peace cannot be easily shaken, because it is rooted in absolute reality.
Precisely.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, awareness alone isn't the finish line.
No, it's just the beginning.
Right, because just staring at the X-ray doesn't magically fix the ankle. Knowing exactly how broken you are is only the diagnostic phase.
Right.
This is where the text moves from observation to action. How does the knight actually take that clearly diagnosed difficulty and initiate forward progress?
How do we move from awareness to alchemy?
Yes, the alchemy.
This transition is the core transformative engine of Chapter 25. The text posits that adversity creates the direct opportunity for change.
So it's not just a coincidence.
No, it goes beyond suggesting that change is an accidental byproduct of a hard time. It argues that adversity is the necessary catalyst.
The necessary catalyst. Okay.
The specific mechanisms for this alchemy are laid out: reevaluating beliefs, building resilience, and growing stronger. This is the formula for transmuting difficulty into progress.
Let's really pull that apart. Reevaluating beliefs. Does suffering force this reevaluation? Because it essentially acts as a stress test that shatters the illusion of control.
That's a huge part of it, yes.
Like, if I construct a life where I believe that if I just follow all the rules and do everything right, I will be safe, and the tragedy strikes anyway, my baseline worldview is broken.
Right. The pain is the symptom of the belief failing.
Wow.
That is the precise psychological mechanism at work here. We all operate on a foundation of implicit beliefs.
Narratives we tell ourselves.
Exactly. We have narratives about what constitutes success, what we are owed by the universe, who we are at our core, how others should treat us.
And when a profound crisis hits,
those foundational beliefs are subjected to extreme pressure, and often they crack. You realize that virtue does not inoculate you against tragedy. You realize that external validation can vanish overnight.
So when the worldview shatters, you face a critical crossroads.
You do. You can desperately try to glue the obsolete pieces back together, which leads to that fragile, crooked healing we talked about, or you can engage in the alchemy of reevaluation.
So we aren't just bouncing back. I think that is a massive misconception about resilience.
Oh, complete.
People define resilience as elasticity like a rubber band.
Yeah.
You get stretched by a terrible event, and then you snap back to exactly the shape you were before.
Right, but the alchemy Pike is describing implies that true resilience is not snapping back at all.
It is allowing the intense heat and pressure of the adversity to melt down your old, failed beliefs and forge them into a completely new, more durable structure.
You are stepping forward as a different entity.
This is where the alchemical metaphor is perfectly suited.
Yeah, in literal alchemy, the goal was to take a base metal, like lead, and subject it to intense processes, calcination, dissolution, purification, until it transformed into gold.
And the knight takes the base, heavy lead of trauma and failed beliefs, subjects it to the fire of awareness and reevaluation, and transmutates it into the gold of a more enlightened, durable self.
The old version of you has to burn away.
Let's ground this high-level philosophy in a tangible example for the listener, because it can sound a bit academic.
Good idea. Let's trace this alchemy through a relatable, albeit painful, modern scenario.
Okay, imagine you have spent the last 15 years of your life pouring every ounce of your identity, your time, and your self-worth into building a specific career.
Right, you're all in.
You have reached the executive level. Your entire conception of who I am is tied to your job title and your salary.
Okay.
And then a massive industry shift occurs, and you're laid off. The company is gone. Your title is gone. You experience a catastrophic collapse of your external identity.
A profoundly destabilizing event that strips away the primary pillar of this hypothetical person's reality.
Exactly. So let's run this through the Knight's protocol. Phase 1, the suffering hits. The default passive reaction is to hide.
To drink too much, to bitterly blame the economy.
Right, to fall into a deep depression because you feel you are now essentially worthless. But if we apply phase 2 awareness, you sit with the devastating pain, you take the x-ray.
You acknowledge the fear and the deep humiliation without numbing it.
And then, phase 3, the alchemy. You begin to reevaluate your foundational beliefs.
So in this scenario, the knight would interrogate the pain to find the flawed belief.
What would they ask?
They would ask, why is the loss of this job causing me to feel like my actual life is over?
And the answer?
It is because I held the foundational belief that my human value was entirely determined by my economic output and my corporate status.
Wow. And the adversity has proven that belief to be incredibly dangerous and fragile.
Right. It failed the stress test. So the alchemy requires letting that belief die. You shed it.
And in its place, you build a new, internally validated belief system.
Perhaps deciding that your worth is tied to your character, your adaptability, and how you treat your family.
Things that cannot be liquidated by a market crash.
Exactly.
The old version of you, the one who worshipped the job title, has to die, which transitions us perfectly into the imagery of the chapter itself.
The Brazen Serpent.
Right, because you cannot embrace this new, durable belief system if you are still desperately clinging to the corpse of the old one. We need to talk about the name the Night of the Brazen Serpent. Why a serpent?
Well, to understand the profound symbolism here, we really have to look at the historical and biblical origins of the brazen serpent, which Pike is drawing directly from.
Let's do a quick history lesson.
So the reference goes back to the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, specifically chapter 21.
Okay.
The Israelites are wandering in the desert after escaping Egypt. They are suffering, they are exhausted, and they begin to complain bitterly against Moses and against God.
Naturally.
And as a consequence, venomous snakes, fiery serpents are sent among them, and many are bitten and begin to die.
So a literal plague of suffering falls upon them.
Yes. When the people repent and ask for help, Moses is instructed to do something deeply paradoxical.
What does he do?
He is told to forge a serpent out of bronze, a brazen serpent, and lift it high on a pole. The instruction is that anyone who is bitten by a venomous snake must look up at the bronze snake on the pole, and if they look at it, they will live. They will be healed.
That paradox is incredible.
Isn't it?
The very image of the thing that is killing them is the instrument of their healing. You have to look directly at the representation of your pain in order to survive it.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate metaphor for the awareness we were just talking about.
Exactly. It is a foundational esoteric principle. The poison contains the cure, provided you have the courage to face it.
You cannot heal from the venom by pretending the snake didn't bite you.
Right. You must look at the brazen serpent. Later in history, this bronze serpent on a pole called the Nehushtan became a profound symbol of therapeutic alchemy and divine healing.
And this is the legacy the night inherits.
It is.
And if we look at the biological reality of the serpent itself, the metaphor deepens even further. Let's talk about the biological necessity of a snake shedding its skin.
Oh, this is a great angle.
As a snake grows, its skin does not grow with it.
Right.
It is a fixed, rigid boundary.
Right.
Eventually, the snake's internal growth causes the old skin to become tight, restrictive, and suffocating. If the snake cannot shed that skin, it will literally be crushed to death by its own past boundary.
And the physical mechanics of that shedding process are violently uncomfortable.
I would imagine.
A snake cannot just wish the old skin away. It has to seek out sharp rocks, rough bark, harsh edges in its environment.
Wow.
It has to aggressively rub itself against the sharpest parts of its reality to tear the old dead skin and peel it back. It utilizes the friction and the adversity of its surroundings to facilitate its own necessary rebirth.
It uses the sharp rocks to scrape off the past burden. That is amazing.
Yeah.
The old skin was incredibly useful once. It protected the snake when it was smaller. It served a vital purpose. But now, at this new stage of growth, holding on to it is lethal.
Exactly. And for the Night of the Brazen Serpent, this translates perfectly to our psychological burdens.
Letting go of past trauma, outdated coping mechanisms, old grudges, failed belief systems. It isn't just a symbolic feel-good exercise for a weekend meditation retreat.
No, it is a strict biological and spiritual requirement for survival.
If you don't use the sharp edges of your current adversity to tear off the old beliefs, they will constrict and suffocate your potential.
The source material heavily emphasizes this concept of continual shedding. It states that the night is continually renewed.
So it's not a one-and-done deal.
Not at all. It is not an event, it is a permanent state of being. And through this rigorous ongoing process of facing the serpent, taking the X-ray, and shedding the dead skin against the sharp rocks of reality, a very specific type of inner strength is developed.
And the text categorizes this strength into a triad, right? Mental clarity, emotional resilience, and spiritual stability.
That's the triad.
Let's break down that triad because it feels like a very deliberate architectural choice by the author. Why these three specific pillars? Let's start with mental clarity. How does shedding the old skin produce mental clarity?
Well, think about the cognitive load required to maintain a false or outdated belief system.
It must be exhausting.
It is. When you are carrying the burden of old resentments or trying to force the reality of your current life to fit the narrative of who you used to be, your mind is constantly clouded by cognitive dissonance.
You are operating in a fog of contradiction.
Exactly. But when you finally shed that dead skin, when you accept reality exactly as it is, the fog lifts. Mental clarity is the absence of cognitive dissonance.
So you can evaluate your present circumstances objectively, without the ghost of your past traumas distorting the data.
Right. You aren't reacting to the shadows on the wall, you are responding to the actual room you're standing in.
Okay, the second pillar is emotional resilience. We touched on this earlier, differentiating it from elasticity. But how does this specific process of the brazen serpent build it?
Emotional resilience in this context is the earned confidence of survival.
Earned confidence.
Yeah. When you have engaged in active endurance, when you have looked at the bronze serpent, faced the deepest venom of your own suffering, and utilized the sharp rocks to shed your skin, you acquire empirical evidence of your own fortitude.
Ah, I see. You know that future pain will not annihilate you, because past pain did not annihilate you.
Exactly. You develop a psychological plasticity. You no longer fear the storm because you know how to build a ship.
And the third pillar, spiritual stability. We discussed the rugged nature of this earlier, but how does it finalize the triad?
Well, if mental clarity allows you to see the path, and emotional resilience gives you the shock absorbers to handle the bumps on the road, spiritual stability is the compass that ensures you are actually heading in the right direction.
It's the anchor.
It is the anchoring of your identity to universal enduring principles rather than fleeting circumstantial outcomes.
So when your spiritual stability is intact, a career failure or a personal rejection doesn't destroy you.
Right, because your core identity is moored to something much deeper than the temporary opinions of society.
I want to highlight the phrase you pulled from the text a minute ago, continually renewed.
Yes, that's crucial.
It is so important to recognize that the knight's journey is a cyclical lifestyle. You don't just achieve a state of awareness, reevaluate your beliefs one time on a Tuesday, and then exist in a state of enlightened perfection forever.
If only it were that easy.
Right. Life will inevitably throw new, completely unexpected storms at you. You will continue to outgrow your new skin.
And the alchemy requires you to constantly identify what new boundary is holding you back and repeatedly lean into the friction to shed it.
And this is where the philosophy directly challenges modern behavioral patterns. There is a profound tendency for people today to take their past traumas and fashion them into a protective identity.
Oh, absolutely.
We think, oh, I was deeply betrayed by someone I loved, so I will carry this memory of betrayal as a warning. I will never trust fully again, and therefore, I will never be hurt again.
We weaponize our old skin.
We turn the dead skin into the impenetrable medieval armor we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Exactly. We convince ourselves that we are protecting our soft underbelly, but we are actually just suffocating our capacity for new connection, new growth, and new joy.
The knight's path of starting fresh, of deliberately choosing to drop the armor, leave the dead skin on the rocks, and walk forward with vulnerability and mental clarity. It's often viewed by a cynical world as naive.
But a close reading of chapter 25 reveals that this choice to be continually renewed is actually the most rigorous, demanding, and brave choice a human being can make.
Because it requires monumental courage to remain open in a world that guarantees you will be wounded again.
Right. It takes real bravery.
Okay, so we have painstakingly established the internal mechanics of this process. We understand the knight's active posture towards suffering. We know how they use the painful X-ray of awareness to diagnose the injury.
Yep.
We see how they use the alchemy of adversity to melt down and reevaluate their beliefs. And we understand the biological necessity of shedding the old skin to forge mental, emotional, and spiritual strength. But this entire massive architecture begs one final glaring question. What is all of this for?
That is the ultimate question.
Like, you don't just spend years in the psychological forge hammering out a beautifully resilient, razor-sharp sword of inner strength just to leave it sitting in the scabbard in your living room. What is the application of this power?
This is where chapter 25 reveals its absolute highest truth, and it represents a magnificent transition in the text.
Tell us.
The source material states unequivocally that the culmination of this grueling, solitary alchemy is that pain can become purpose.
Pain becomes purpose.
The knight does not endure the calcination of his ego and the shedding of his skin just to keep the resulting strength for himself. He doesn't build up this rugged spiritual stability just so he can retreat to a mountaintop and exist in peaceful, isolated superiority.
No guru on a mountain here.
No. He uses the data he extracted from the storm. He takes his newfound strength and he uses it to actively help others, to facilitate their growth, and to create communal meaning.
It is the ultimate transmutation. We are watching the shift from the fiercely internal landscape we started in back out into the radically external world.
It perfectly completes the cycle. The journey of the Knight of the Brazen Serpent has to begin in the most intensely personal, isolated space possible, the individual crucible of deep suffering.
Because no one else can take the X-ray for you.
Exactly. But the journey only culminates in outward service. According to the philosophy of the text, the healing process is not considered structurally complete until the results of that healing are shared.
Let's look at the mechanics of that final transition.
Yeah.
The text essentially argues that helping others and creating meaning are not separate activities you do after you heal.
Right.
They're the final crystallizing stages of the healing itself. It is as if the initial trauma, the raw suffering, is just unrefined lead.
Okay, stick with the alchemy metaphor.
Yeah, so the agonizing awareness, the destruction of all beliefs, the tearing of the skin against the rocks, that is the intense heat and pressure of the alchemical forge.
Right.
But the gold, the actual tangible end product of the entire process is communal purpose. And the alchemy isn't finished until you hand that gold to someone else.
That is a flawless articulation of the Knight's philosophy. If you undergo all of this suffering and transformation only to make yourself more comfortable, you have fundamentally missed the higher calling of the degree.
Wow.
The brilliance of this framework is that your pain is transformed from a meaningless personal tragedy into a highly specialized tool.
A specialized tool, how so?
Because you have walked through the specific fire of your unique trauma, you possess a detailed topographical map of that specific hell that no one else has.
See.
You know exactly where the hidden pitfalls are, you know how suffocating the smoke gets, and most importantly, you know exactly how to find the exit.
Carl Jung wrote extensively about this with his archetype of the wounded healer.
Oh, perfect connection.
Yeah, the premise is that it is exactly the healer's own unhealed wounds that provide the empathy and the specific knowledge required to cure the patient. A doctor who has never been sick can only prescribe medicine from a textbook.
Right.
But a healer who has survived the venom understands the psychological terror of the bite. They can offer a completely different level of salvation.
And that is why the Knight's journey is so vital. By offering that salvation to others, a remarkable psychological reversal occurs regarding the original trauma.
Explain that.
We often talk about searching for meaning in life as if it is an objective artifact hidden under a rock that we just have to stumble upon.
Like it's just waiting to be found.
Exactly. But the esoteric text suggests that meaning is not found. It is created through this final stage of transmutation.
How so? By helping people.
By taking your arbitrary, chaotic, unfair suffering and making the conscious decision to use the lessons from it to pull someone else out of the fire, you retroactively assign meaning to your own pain.
That's profound.
You declare, through your actions, that the suffering was not for nothing. It wasn't just a random act of a cruel universe. It was the intense training required for you to become the specific guide that another person desperately needed.
You completely strip the trauma of its power over you.
Precisely. You shift from being the helpless victim of the experience to being the absolute master and architect of its outcome.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I want to take a moment and connect this vast 19th century philosophical framework directly to you, the person listening to this deep dive right now.
Take inventory.
Yes. Take a mental inventory of the specific challenges, the deep losses, the agonizing failures, and the unique pains that have carved out who you are today, the things you would not wish on your worst enemy.
The heavy stuff.
Look at that inventory. How are you responding to those items today? Are you still trapped in the phase of passive endurance? Are you hiding in the basement, holding your breath, waiting for the past to somehow change?
Are you carrying all that dead skin around like a suffocating suit of armor, terrified of the next strike?
Chapter 25 of Morals and Dogma is reaching across a century and a half to challenge you. It is asking you to look directly at your deepest, most jagged struggles, to look at the brazen serpent on the pole, and ask a terrifying, incredibly beautiful question.
That's the question.
How can I use this highly specific pain to build a bridge for the person who is walking right behind me?
It is a question that requires everything of you, but it offers everything in return.
It really does. Let's take a step back and synthesize the monumental architecture we have unpacked in this deep dive into the Knight of the Brazen Serpent.
Let's do it.
We began by shattering the illusion of the armor, realizing that attempting to deflect all pain is a trap that prevents growth. We established that suffering is an unavoidable feature of the human condition, but that adopting an active posture of endurance allows us to extract vital data from the storm.
And then we explore the absolute necessity of taking the X-ray, the brutal prerequisite of deep holistic awareness to ensure we do not heal crooked.
Right. We walked through the intense alchemical process of allowing adversity to melt down our fragile, outdated belief systems so they can be reforged into resilient truths.
We looked at the biological and spiritual imperative of the serpent shedding its skin against the sharp rocks of reality.
A continuous process that clears the fog of cognitive dissonance and builds a rugged triad of mental clarity, emotional elasticity, and spiritual stability.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate transmutation, the realization that the forge of adversity does not exist for our own personal perfection, but to refine our pain into a specialized tool of purpose. We heal ourselves so that we can become the wounded healer for the community.
It is a stunning, comprehensive map for human resilience. And what is fascinating about the structure of Pike's work is that this architecture perfectly sets the stage for where the text goes next.
The next chapter.
Yes, because once you have transformed your pain into purpose, and you've committed to wading back into the world to help others, you are going to encounter people who are still acting out of their unhealed trauma.
Right, and you are going to need a new set of tools to deal with them.
Which is exactly what Chapter 26 provides. In the next degree, which focuses on the Prince of Mercy, the text shifts its focus from internal fortitude toward outward compassion, radical forgiveness, and deep empathetic understanding.
These are the natural, required evolutionary steps that build directly upon the capacity to help others that the Knight has just developed.
You cannot truly offer profound mercy to someone who wrongs you until you intimately understand the anatomy of human suffering, which is exactly what the 25th degree teaches.
It is all connected. You must conquer the internal fire before you can distribute the water of mercy.
I love that. As we wrap up this deep dive into the Night of the Brazen Serpent, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over as you transition back into the routine of your day.
Leave them with a good one.
We spent a lot of time talking about the mechanics of turning pain into purpose and using your hard-won map of the fire to guide others to safety. But let's push that concept one step further to its absolute logical conclusion. If the ultimate lesson of the night is that our pain is meant to be transmuted into a tool to serve the community, what if the deepest, most confusing, most isolating struggles you are facing right now aren't actually about you at all? Wow. What if your current adversity, the very storm that feels like it is tearing the roof off your life today, is simply the universe meticulously forging you into the exact, highly specialized guide that someone else is going to desperately need tomorrow?
That changes everything.
It really does. Maybe it is time to stop fighting the wind. Maybe it is time to take off the heavy armor, step fully into the storm, and let the chaos teach you everything it knows. Because someone out there is lost in the dark, and they're going to need